Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Amadeus from 1984. Now, this is a movie that I have put off for a long time, and to be honest, the main reason for that is its sheer length. This movie, in its director's cut, which is the one that is most widely available or has been for a long time, is over 3 hours. And there aren't too many movies, even these days, that clock in at over 3 hours. There are, however, I think 2 or 3 others on my working list that are in the same position of, I'd really like to watch this movie, but it's over 3 hours, and I just don't have the time or fortitude to get myself through that. So I haven't gotten around to this one for a long time. I don't actually remember why this came up this week, but I ended up watching it anyway. And I also found out that up until recently, in fact this year I believe, you could not get the original theatrical cut of the movie it was not distributed, basically. It hadn't been distributed for, I think, since 2002, which is pretty impressive. That's fairly rare. So, out of curiosity, I also checked in on... I watched the director's cut, but I also checked in on the theatrical cut to get a side-by-side comparison and see what had been changed. I think there's about 25 minutes worth of footage-ish cut from the original, but there are also some very minor changes. I'll get into those later. This is a movie that should drag more than it does. And while admittedly, I try not to take breaks in the middle of watching movies. I like to see them as they're paced and so on, but I actually did get interrupted in the middle and had to go do something else for a little bit. So there was a 20-minute break somewhere in the middle. But generally speaking, I think this is actually a very well-paced film, even at 3 hours. What's interesting is that I've heard previously when people talk about this movie, they say, oh, well, more could be cut out of it, or I saw some notes from comparison to theatrical, that the theatrical is considered a better cut because it has better pacing or better editing or something like that. And I have to say, I disagree. I actually think that the director's cut, even the director themselves apparently said they prefer the theatrical cut. I disagree. I think that cutting the content that they do cut out of the director's cut to make it the theatrical length, which is still an absurd 2 hours, 40 minutes, it cuts out too many moments of key sort of interactions that inform future information and feelings between characters. And for that alone, I have to say I prefer the director's cut. If you really wanted to tighten up this film in some way, there are lots of other places that you could make cuts. It would change the movie fairly significantly stylistically, but I think in theory there are a couple of different ways you could cut this by maybe up to 40 minutes, either by omitting fairly minor scenes, shortening certain scenes that just don't need to be as long, although there's no problem with them being as long as they are. Or what this movie does quite a lot, which is have very extended scenes of performances of various operas and librettos and things like that. But I think all of those would be mistakes. Part of the appeal, I think, for this movie is if you are a little bit of a classical music fan, which is what I would qualify myself as. I think if you have no interest whatsoever in classical music, or you don't like it, then you're going to have a bad time probably, because this is about, well, in addition to just being about Mozart, it is in a significant way addressing directly the music and works of him and other people who are around him at the time. And so if you're just not into that or bored by it, you're immediately going to be turned off by that. So I don't think you can fix that, and I think it would be a mistake to remove it as a result. but there are some scenes, there are some elements that I think could be lost. There are individual performances that I think could be lost with not too much overall loss if you really wanted to cut it. But again, I think it's fairly well paced, all things considered. This is interesting. This movie's interesting in a whole lot of ways. I think it's fairly well directed. I think there are certain shots and scenes that I don't love how they're composed or things like that, and generally it doesn't often wow me with its visuals. There are some shots that I actually think are very well thought of but kind of poorly executed, so they're not as artistic and visually interesting and visually engaging as they could be. But the whole thing ties together in a way that doesn't really bother me too much. Another thing that's interesting is that story-wise, this really covers a fairly long amount of time, but it's fake. The problem is that it's a fake story. I am not an expert on Mozart. Like I said, I'm not an expert on classical music. I do like classical music quite a lot, and I have my preferences. And Mozart is somebody I appreciate, but not one of my preferred composers historically. So I only know a little bit about him. However, I know enough to know that this is a very narrow band of story, and in addition, it's not very accurate to history. This is, as I understand it, I believe adapted from a stage play that came out in the 70s. I might be mistaken on that. And which is basically about this rivalry between, or supposed rivalry between, Mozart and one of his contemporaries, Salieri, who is less well remembered. But by all accounts, there's very little to lead, historical documentation to lead anyone to believe they were really had any much of any animosity. They might have seen each other as rivals in the sense of, competition in the realms of, being employed as artists, but beyond that, certainly not to the level that this story of this movie, which I won't spoil, paints it as. And in addition, something that I know a bit better than even that is that Mozart had a lot of contemporaries at the time in Austria and in Vienna. He was also not just in Vienna. This is centered almost solely in Vienna, but he was, well known outside of Vienna as well, and probably more arguably in Prague than in Vienna, I think. But again, don't quote me on that. And there were a lot of other people who he is associated with either directly or indirectly. So there's people like Haydn and Beethoven and all these others who would either be there at the time or come shortly thereafter, who were contemporaries or influences or influenced by or from him. And I've mangled that sentence, but you get the point. So really focusing on like two characters with a cast around them would already be a very narrow view if it also wasn't deeply inaccurate. But that doesn't change the fact that it's an entertaining story. This doesn't seem to strive to be a biopic. Now, at the same time, Mozart was a notable weirdo. There's all kinds of stories about him, writings that he did, just being kind of a weird little goofball. And he was kind of a party dude and just loved to live it up, much to probably what caused his actual death. Just basically getting too drunk too much and probably dying of liver failure. So there's a lot around him, and there's a lot of stories that could be told about him, and there's a lot of mystery about what really happened to him. So I kind of want to be a little bit grumpy about it for not being historically accurate, um, but there's very little to complain about there. It's an entertaining story, and that's really what it needs to be. I do love the costuming and the makeup that's done in this movie. It's fantastic all around. Everybody is made up or made down as much as they need to be. They really put their all into every garment, every wig, every dirt smear of dirt, everything. You really get a perspective both on the characters themselves and then the settings as well. Some really beautiful sets, both interiors of smaller rooms, interiors of the palace, interiors of various venues, and then there's in particular it stuck out to me. I was like, when I saw this shot, it's a decent way into the film. There's a long shot when when a character's traveling through this long row of it's like a market basically, and all I could think as I was watching it was, man, this is like a very expensive shot to have set up. Like all of these people in costume doing a bunch of stuff. And it's out in open air, so there's like so many things that could go wrong with it. How many takes they would have had to do with it, I don't know. And all I could think was, this has got to be incredibly expensive. Let me put a pin in this and figure out if they ever do it again. Like, surely they couldn't have done this only once, but they did. As far as I could realize, they only used that shot, that set, those people once. I mean, I'm sure, some of those extras were in other scenes as well and that sort of thing, but by all accounts, just a crazy shot to include that they didn't really need to include. It's a transitional shot, and it must have cost them a lot to do and hurt a lot to execute. So that one actually does stick out to me as a very impressive and interesting it's a series of shots. It's not a oneer. But that's neither here nor there. As far as the performances and the actors go, I think there are some really, really excellent performances. I think that the standout is probably F. Murray Abraham playing Salieri. He is bordering on, like, he's very grounded, but he's bordering on chewing on the scenery. Like he is living his character up, and I love it. But everybody else is doing great as well. I think Tom Hulse or Hulsa, I don't know, as Mozart is also incredibly memorable. He's played in this very sort of affable, kind of almost silly a lot of the time kind of way, but also an obviously somewhat tragic character. And then a lot of the other folks, like, I love Jeffrey Jones in everything. Him playing the Emperor here is fantastic. And in general, everybody's facial acting in particular and their body acting, their non-speaking acting is doing a lot. And when you have a lot of characters who are supposed to be sort of prim and proper a lot of the time, it's those subtleties in the body acting that tell you about their reactions. Slight movements in the mouth and the eyes and the face, and shifting of the feet and little shift moves in the hands and things like that. Like, those start to go a long way when you've got these types of characters. So really across the board, pretty much all of the actors, really, really great. I am gonna say that one did bother me a little bit, and I have mixed feelings about it. The woman who plays Constance Mozart, Mozart's wife, her performance is fantastic. I really like her. Her physical acting, her like line delivery is really, really good. However, it does stick out that her, in quite a lot of scenes, and it varies actually from line to line in some scenes, which makes it what makes it more distracting. Her delivery and her affect is very inconsistent and very American. And while this is not in German, or Italian. Well, they do have some words in German and Italian. And most of the actors are either are British or are affecting a British accent, because that's how Hollywood does anything that happens in Europe but needs to be performed in English. Hers is notably inconsistent and often extremely American. Mozart's affect is also somewhat inconsistent and fairly American compared to everybody else, but it is not as noticeable. Hers is just very, very American, to be like certain lines and certain scenes where it almost feels like nobody directed her to, change her accent properly. Just stuck out to me a little, more than a little bit. Didn't ruin her performance by any means, and the rest of her performance is so good that it's hard for me to hold it against her, but like it did stick out compared to everything else. As far as the rest of like the composition overall as a whole, I think it's very, very solid. Like I already said, it's difficult to make a fair judgment on this if you are, not already predisposed to like a longer film that's sort of biopic-esque and is about classical music. But I think it does such a wonderful job of interweaving interpersonal disputes, personal struggles, family and friends, the sort of ideas of nobility and how one holds themselves, and the way that certain people uproot or try to maintain those things. All really interesting while interwoven with a lot of very good musical performances. Performing a lot of these pieces with, as far as I could tell, live orchestras. Maybe it was overdubbed after or something like that. But, those were actually performed as far as I could tell. And just a lot of fun scenes and back and forths. It's interesting in tone because it does sort of waver. It starts on a very comedic note and ends on a fairly dour one, but it gently transitions between the two. The ending being very dramatic, the beginning being very comedic, but it having, tones of both all the way throughout. As far as... I think that more or less covers it. I don't know if I love this movie. It's one that has a lot going on in it. And could they have told a more concise story? Possibly. Could they have cut out certain elements? It's actually, just as a sidebar, it's really fascinating to me that the whole thing is framed as a story being told by Salieri in his old age many years later. That framework is very interesting, and I'd be curious what happens if you try and make a version of the film that doesn't include that. I think it works, but I think it is, without the narrator, and such a biased narrator in particular, it becomes a significantly less compelling film, but I'm not entirely sure. So I'd actually be kind of curious what that looks like. It's a really fascinating film. I don't think it's, a all-time stunner, but I think it's got a lot of really interesting things going on, and tries to be an epic while not taking itself excessively seriously. It's not really yanking at your heartstrings too hard. It's just telling a good, solid, entertaining story, and I really appreciate that. I think that's about all I've got to say about it. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next time.